Research Associate at the Chicago Field Museum. In 2010 and 2011, that season, and 2017, 2018, Dr. Makovicki was co-leader with Nate Smith of a multinational team of paleontologists. Working in the balmy Antarctic summers in sub-zero temperatures on Mount Fitzpatrick at 12,000 feet, the team revisited a likely fossil site first identified in 1990. The project was funded by the National Science Foundation, as you heard, and several other entities. Soon after the 2018 trip, as the Field Museum's Associate Curator and Chair of the Department of Geology, Peter conceived and organized the touring exhibit now at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and I believe it's closing the end of next week. It's been there since January. The exhibit describes the rigors of working in such extreme conditions, but more importantly, demonstrates the sciences of geology, paleontology, evolutionary biology, and what they tell us about the adaptability of life. With the expedition's discovery of early Jurassic dinosaurs from about 195 million years ago, Dr. Makovicki seeks to understand the adaptations of those animals to conditions in the South Polar region during the period that Gondwana was beginning to break up. And those of you who attended my program on Gondwana and Australia will remember some of that. Peter got his PhD from Columbia University in 2002, following a master's and BS degrees from Copenhagen University in Denmark, where he grew up. And so, Dr. Makovicki, very pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be there with you, virtually speaking. It is finally warming up here in Minnesota, and I hope you can all see my screen now. In honor of being in Florida virtually, I have my palm tree shirt on. That's probably more of a sense of me just being ready for winter to be over, psychologically. So it's kind of funny to be pushed back into Antarctica and it's beautiful summer weather that you see on this slide here. Anyway, today I want to talk to you a little bit about the project that, of course, is highlighted in the Antarctic Dinosaurs exhibit that I assume many, if not all of you, have been to visit. And I want to put it into a broader sort of historical context, not just of paleontology and science, but also of exploration of some of the most remote parts of the world that are still remote today. And what makes Antarctica different, of course, is its climate, which, as you can see here, is cold and dominated by ice and snow. So Antarctica sits over the South Pole, and it is isolated from the other continents by oceans. And by virtue of the sort of circulation, ocean current circulation, it's essentially cut off from warm waters that are, of course, being heated equatorially and then are distributing heat across the planet in various ways. So, for example, the heat being generated in the region where you guys live in Florida is being transported by the Gulf Stream to warm up Northern Europe, which, if it didn't have the Gulf Stream, would have temperatures more similar to what we're used to in Minnesota at this same latitude. But in Antarctica, those circumpolar currents essentially are cold, and they cut off the circulation of more warm waters, leading to what we see today, which is, of course, an icebound continent with ice that's up to 2 miles thick over the polar plateau over the center of the continent, and is, of course, flowing outwards between sort of the larger East Antarctic ice sheet that you see here, and then the West Antarctic ice sheet with the Transantarctic mountains that you see running from the peninsula and down here, basically as the dividing line. And these will play a fundamental role in what we talk about today. These cold water currents that I've been talking about can be extremely nutrition rich. And so in Antarctica today, the combination of very nutrient rich cold currents and an icebound continent mean that the animals we find there are very unusual. They are rare and unique, what we call endemic, so unique to the Antarctic continent. They're also all tied basically to the marine ecosystem. So here we see a couple of denizens. This is a picture I took in 2010 right off Hut Point, which you'll see, of a little Adelie penguin getting all flustered because of a Weddell seal approaching it here in the waters. And these are very unique animals. We love watching documentaries with them. They do, of course, come up to breathe air and rest on land. The penguins and the seals will have their young on the ice or on land, but they are effectively speaking part of the marine ecosystem because there are no complex terrestrial ecosystems on Antarctica today. However, if we look at the past, that was, of course, very different. And what we actually know about Antarctic ecosystems of the past has really only been amassed in the last 50 to 70 years. Until quite recently, historically, Antarctica was sort of terra incognita, an unknown continent that was very difficult to get to and even more difficult to survive on. And so much of the early history of Antarctic exploration was not so much about science, but it was just simply about finding out what was there. Here's a map of expeditions that sort of approached and then finally breached the Antarctic continent from early on. As you'll see, most of these expeditions were basically shipborne, like James Cook's expedition here, his next to last one, I think, where he approached the Antarctic continent, got within range of it into the sea ice pack, and then turned back. Landfall in Antarctica didn't actually happen until the early 1800s. 1821 was the first landing on Antarctica by a whaling party. And then later on in the early or the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the first scientific expeditions started probing in towards the continent, focusing at first on the Antarctic Peninsula that you see up here, which is the most approachable part of the continent. It's the closest to South America. And then later on in the late 1800s came the first attempt at reaching the South Pole, usually from the Ross Ice Shelf, where the distance is the shortest. So it's really not been much more than 100 years since people have actually entered the deep interior of this continent and began to learn about its natural history and its geology. And these early expeditions were, of course, from the 1900s, were done in the name of science to some degree. And so the first fossils that were found come from out here, the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. If any of you have been on an Antarctic cruise, you've most probably gone to this part of the world. It's known as the James Ross Basin. And you have a series of islands sheltered behind the tip of the peninsula here that preserve, in addition to the ice that's ubiquitous, a great variety of rocks from the Mesozoic and Cenozoic ages. And the first discovered fossils were picked up here in 1902 by a Swedish Antarctic expedition. And interestingly enough, the Swedes had brought with them an American artist Frederick Stokes, who was there to actually paint the scenery. They were taking pictures. They had, of course, the old glass plate cameras, but they realized those were all black and white. And so they brought an artist to capture what they were seeing in color. And Stokes, as he did some beach combing along the peninsula there, was able to pick up a number of fossils, including this Steinkern, sort of this impression fossil of a small lobster carapace. You can see the part of the lobster it represents. And Stokes got lucky. He spent one Antarctic summer there and then left on the resupply ships, whereas the Swedes, the scientific crew, were meant to stay there over winter, do some more exploration, and be picked up the next year. And as is very common in Antarctic exploration, their ship, of course, got crushed by sea ice. They ended up staying 2 winters and finally being rescued by the Argentine Navy. And in the meantime, Stokes had given his collection of fossils to a professor at the University of Chicago who had published them. So published the first knowledge of fossils from Antarctica without ever having been there. And to add insult to injury, he, in the paper, called it a Belgian Antarctic expedition instead of a Swedish Antarctic one. So a little bit of scientific rancor in those early days. Following these discoveries in the Antarctic Peninsula and exploration out there, came the more ambitious plan, mainly by British explorers, to try and get to the continental interior and to reach the geographic South Pole in here. And so they approached from the west side of Antarctica, which in this picture is pointing downwards. And they landed up here on at McMurdo on Ross Island. And that would be the shortest distance to basically go from landing a boat to reaching the interior pole. But in the process, they had to actually traverse the Trans-Antarctic Mountains to get up onto the plateau here. And these expeditions were led by famous people that you've probably heard of. Robert Falcon Scott led 2 of them. Ernest Shackleton led the other one. And they all basically started from the same point and went through a couple of glaciers that cut through the central Transantarctic Mountains, conveying ice from the plateau. It basically flows down to the Ross Ice Shelf here. And one of these, the route Scott took on his second expedition to reach the pole, cut through the Beardmore Glacier region. So he started here at Ross Island. This map is turned upside down relative to the satellite image you just saw. But he traversed the ice shelf, and then to get through the mountains, he basically followed the Beardmore Glacier that you see here. And in the process, basically began examining the rocks that you see here. And these are sequences of sedimentary rocks. You can see these nice dark bands of coal in here, representing peat accumulation in the distant past, capped by these thick basalts, so volcanic flows that you see on top. So you have evidence here, clearly, of Antarctica's geologic past, including of very different environments, because to deposit coals, you have to have an overabundance of vegetation, more vegetation than can be consumed or decayed, so that it actually gets buried and sequestered. And the fascinating thing is that Robert Falcon Scott was on this quest to reach the pole. He was actually racing against a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen, who started at a slightly different spot on the Ross Ice Shelf, cutting through here. And given a combination of factors, which included the principally that the Norwegians used sled dogs, a capacity they'd learned from living with the Inuit in Greenland, and the British chose to man-haul their sleds in this manner, the Norwegians beat them by a full 6 weeks. And by the time that Robert Falcon Scott did reach the pole, only to discover that he had been beaten by the Norwegians, he did plant the British flag, of course, his men were starving. They didn't have enough food, and the journey had taken longer than expected because of hauling the sleds. They'd miscalculated their supplies. They were basically starving. And yet, Robert Falcon Scott decided, prompted by his chief officer, to explore these rocks and actually make a collection of fossils and minerals from the Central Transantarctic Mountains. And he clearly deemed these important enough that as they were making their journey back and starving, they died just short of one of their depots, only 11 miles away in a snowstorm. This is where their cairn is, where they were found the following year. The last thing that was found on his sled, they jettisoned everything else to lighten their load. There's the sled. The last thing that was found was a box with about 30 pounds of rocks that they had collected from the Central Transantarctic Mountains. So even in their dying moments, they considered the scientific legacy of what they were trying to achieve in Antarctica so important that they clung on to them even after they'd gotten rid of everything else except their last tent and their sleeping bags. So very powerful and moving story there. And one of the things that was found on that sled was this coalified fossil that you see here. And this is on loan from the British Museum of Natural History in London. And it was, of course, collected on that Terra Nova expedition of Robert Falcon Scott's. And it contains leaf impressions of a now extinct seed fern called Glossopteris. You can see a better preserved, more beautiful example of Glossopteris here. So these very sort of lanceolate, elongate tooth, leaves. Glossopteris means tongue leaf in Greek. And these, of course, indicated that in the past, the interior of Antarctica must have been vastly different than it is today. But despite Falcon Scott's sacrifices to make these collections, attention to Antarctic research, of course, disappeared. His expedition, these made it back to London in 1914, whereupon immediately the First World War began, and very shortly after the Second World War. And during the war and interwar years, the world's attention was, of course, turned away from Antarctica. And it wasn't until about a decade after World War II that scientists and governments started taking an interest in the continent again. And this culminated in the 1957-1958 International Geophysical Year, where scientific societies, prompted by and supported by various governments, made a concerted effort, international effort, to actually explore the Antarctic continent. This was very much spearheaded by the United States and the United States Navy through what is called Operation Deep Freeze. Technically, Deep Freeze is still continuing today. It is one of the longest standing operations in the United States military history. And it involved the emplacement of a number of research stations, both permanent ones that you see on the map of Antarctica, or this photosat of Antarctica here, as well as a number of temporary ones along the margins that are no longer in use. And it's the emplacement of these bases, principally McMurdo down here, which became a gateway for researchers to get into Antarctica and really start understanding its distant past. McMurdo today looks like this. You have a number of prefab buildings. These are all dorms. Then there's a number of workshops and other spaces up here. Laboratories would be off to the side here. And the whole thing is powered mainly by wind power. Originally, back in the 1950s, the Navy had a small nuclear reactor that's since been dismantled. And the station can actually house up to 2,000 people in the summer months. It is the largest permanent settlement in Antarctica today, by far. The next largest is an order of magnitude smaller, about 100 people. And this is the principal gateway that allows scientists to now access the interior of Antarctica. And it's a historical place as well. Here in the foreground of the slide, you actually see this wooden bush hut, which Robert Falcon Scott brought down on his first expedition. So not the one he died on, but the previous one where he made his first attempt to reach the pole. And this is sort of a prefab hut he bought in Australia on his way down. And it's very well preserved because everything here is frozen. Um, and the reason he went here to Ross Island and why McMurdo Base is there today is that this is basically as far south as you can get a ship. This is the NSF's Nathan S. Gould research vessel there today. Sometimes they need to contract an icebreaker to actually get all the way in there. But in the summer, this is as far as you can get a ship. So here is the Discovery Huts, Falcon Scott's Discovery Hut with his vessel, the Discovery, behind it in the 1904 expedition. And here you get a view inside that hut. So it's not exactly, luxury five-star living. This is a stove that they cooked on, but this is essentially a time capsule. It's frozen in time. You can even still see some of the penguins and remains of seals that were being butchered by Falcon Scott and also Shackleton's crews that also use this hut. But fast forwarding to the emplacement of McMurdo and sort of the first base there, this led to a long-standing and about 50-year program now of exploration of Antarctica's interior, especially focused on the central transantarctic mountains, where you get bedrock above ice level and therefore can access the distant history of this planet. And here you see one of the camps. This is a 1970 camp, the remains of the 1970 camp, and a subsequent 1978 camp that you see over here, which included the first paleontological expeditions to basically start looking into the Antarctica's distant past. And that was all prompted by the discovery of the first vertebrate fossils in Triassic rocks, about 230 million years old, in this area known as the Cumulus Hills. So that happened in 1969. In 1970, the National Science Foundation funded a explicitly paleontological expedition to go to these areas. It was co-led by Ned Colbert of the American Museum of Natural History in New York and a very famous South African paleontologist named James Kitchen, whom you see here, excavating specimens of a small mammal relative, a cynodont called Thrinaxonon. And in many ways, it was incredibly fortuitous that Kitching was leading these expeditions, because these early Triassic faunas he was excavating were incredibly familiar to him. In fact, they were exactly the same animals he was used to collecting in his native South Africa from rocks of the same age. And the scientific impact of that was very, very profound, because in 1970, the debates as to whether continental drift and plate tectonics were real or not was still very much alive. Although the history of plate tectonics as a scientific hypothesis dates back to the 1910s, led by Alfred Wegener, it really wasn't until the 1950s and mapping of the ocean floor that evidence started to mount in favor of this as being a viable hypothesis and not being treated as a crackpot fringe idea by most of the geological community. And even in the 1970s, there were still considerable holdouts against plate tectonics as a viable hypothesis. So these fossils that were collected by James Kitching were incredibly significant because, as he noted, all the animals were ones he would attribute to a fauna called the Lystrosaurus fauna, well known from the Karoo Basin of South Africa. And the fact that he found exactly the same animals, terrestrial animals, animals that didn't swim across oceanic distances in South Africa and Antarctica, was then a very strong line of evidence in support of the continents having once been together, combined in Gondwana, and therefore also of the subsequent drift that must have brought them apart. And so the things that were being found in Antarctica from the 1970s forward include a number of lineages. Here's Lystrosaurus, that we know is present in Antarctica, India, South Africa, now even Asia. Various plants, Glossopteris that you've already met, is also widespread on the southern hemisphere continents. And all of the distribution of these really only makes sense if you actually fit the continents together, which thankfully their coastlines actually have very natural contours that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So this was incredibly strong evidence for continental drift and for the presence of a united Pangea of all the continents coming together. So let's fast forward to from this point on to my involvement in Antarctic paleontology. Because of the limited exposure of rocks that are available to geologists and paleontologists, we tend to hit the same sites as these explorers did in the 1970s and up through the 1980s and 1990s. In particular, we target one area of the Central Transantarctic Mountains known as the Cumulus Hills, near the Shackleton Glacier, named after the explorer, which would be on the bottom edge down here. And this is sort of the last redoubt, if you will, of rocks before the plateau, which is up here. You can actually see the contours in the ice as it breaks and flows down towards the Shackleton Glacier and ultimately the sea. And I'm going to do this chronologically in reverse order of my expeditions, but in the geological order of when we were there. So in 2017-18, the austral summer of 17-18, I was part of a bigger expedition with scientists from Los Angeles County Museum, the University of Washington, the Iziko Museum in Cape Town, South Africa, and associated students to the Cumulus Hills region. As you can see here, it's layered sedimentary rocks intermingled with layers of volcanic rock that you see behind me there. And we were based out of a camp placed on the Shackleton Glacier, which you can see from the air here. These little ant tracks down here, that's actually our camp. That little slightly darker smear in the ice surface here is our runway where we would land to fly in and out. And this is the landscape, the absolutely amazing landscape that surrounded us. And we were blessed with beautiful weather like this most of the time. And zooming in, this was sort of the camp at a finer or a zoomed in scale. So this is where we stayed in individual small tents, and we had a kitchen galley here, a couple of support tents for the crews that maintained the helicopters and aircraft, science tents, and then tents for refueling and other supplies. And this is where we based out of. So this was home away from home for about 6 weeks. And yes, you can actually air dry your laundry in Antarctica. Even though it's cold and water freezes instantly, the air is so dry that the ice will actually sublimate off your clothes in the sunshine. It'll dry. It takes a little while, but yes, you can keep your clothes clean in Antarctica, which is kind of nice, because you're wearing the same stuff all the time. Not too far away, we were targeting the Cumulus Hills, and as I already said, these are places that have been previously visited by other teams. Here are actually the remains of the 1970 and 1978 camps from that picture I showed you earlier, still poking out of the ice. Nowadays, with a lot more environmental concerns, we actually picked up a couple of abandoned oil barrels that were left here so that they don't contaminate the ice as part of this trip. So there is a very different attitude, I would say, 50 years on from what the early guys were doing. And we would target these rocks in the surrounding hills that looked something like this. So this is a typical exposure of early Triassic fossil-bearing rocks. You will see that the sedimentary layers are arrayed in sort of these slopes that represent softer muddy overbank deposits where flooding happened and deposited fine sediment on the landscape, interspersed with these smaller cliff or ledge forming sand and gravel beds that are a little more resistant to weathering. And these were formed by braided streams that traverse the landscape. And so these braided streams tend to pick up everything, larger particles, pebbles, and even bone bits. So a lot of the bone you actually find is in these gravel lags that you can see in the upper right here. So these small white specks are actually bits of rolled bone. They aren't very informative as to what animals were living there. So we actually tend to target these softer beds in between, where the fine-grained sediments can capture more complete specimens. Here is a cross-section. Here's some of that finer sediment, I should say, with a cross-section of a small amphibian skull. That's about the width across the sides there is about the width across a human thumb. So these are sort of the rocks we are looking for. And obviously, these are placed on various mountains, somewhere between 5 and 45 miles from where our camp is. So we would actually have to commute to these places by helicopter. So this was sort of the one limiting factor, I would say, to our field workers, that we and all the other science teams have to share these. We had excellent coordinators. We were able to get out most days and basically get our work done. And this was, of course, a great way to commute to work if you're not afraid of heights. Gives you an amazing view of the Antarctic continent. And then once we would get to our individual fossil sites, we would basically be doing the same kind of fossil hunting that we would do anywhere else in the world, let's say Montana or the more Gobi Desert or the more classical hunting grounds for fossils around the world. So you basically walk across rock. You try to find as much exposed rock as you can. Here are some sedimentary rocks. The snow does interfere. It doesn't take a lot of snow to cover up the rocks and make it impossible to find fossils. But you essentially end up looking for something that looks a little bit different in color and texture. And here you can actually see a small, slightly different colored amount of rock, slightly different textured, that indicates that there's a fossil under here. And then you have to extract it. And the thing about the central transantarctic mountains, as I already mentioned, is you have these extensive volcanic layers. You see this chocolatey brown stuff behind my butt in the photo. That's all rhyolite. That's volcanic rock. These rocks are intruded. They didn't flow out of volcanoes. Instead, they kind of pushed their way between seams and cracks in the existing rock body. And in the process, they heated and baked the sediments that were already there. So these rocks are slightly metamorphosed, which makes them incredibly hard. And so one major difference between working in Antarctica and other parts of the world is that you end up having to use a lot more power tools. And that's, of course, heavy. You have to carry the tools, you have to carry the gas. That's both demanding on helicopter time, it's demanding physically because we're at 10,000 feet here in very cold weather. And then when we get to the Jurassic sites, we'll be at 12,000 feet, very thin air to be moving heavy equipment. The fossils, however, can be fantastic. So the specimen I'm cutting out in this photo ended up looking like this. This is a small specimen of Lystrosaurus, that very same animal that James Kitching referred to in his conclusion to that famous science paper, saying that the Lystrosaurus and the other animals living alongside it in Antarctica are exactly the same as the ones living in South Africa, and therefore providing evidence for continental drift. And I should say that that picture I showed you, the first fossil find, that was this little patch of the top of the skull of Lystrosaurus. So that little crumb led to an amazing and complete specimen that you see here. Total length, I should say, is about 2 feet long along the curve of the back to the tip of the snout. So not a big animal. Now, a lot of people will ask me, but don't you have to dig through the ice to get to the fossils? And I answer, no, normally we don't. Thanks to plate tectonics, we have mountains that pushed up high enough to be above the ice. But occasionally, nature throws us a loop. This was another Lystrosaurus. You can see the ribs aligned here. That unfortunately ended up being a terrible fossil specimen. So not at all like the picture you just saw, because you have this ice vein, which was about 2 inches thick, that had sort of worked its way through freeze thawing in under the specimen. And basically when we popped it up, we were able to salvage some of it, but most of it was just preserved in ice and therefore not salvageable. So you do run into some challenges that you wouldn't have collecting fossils elsewhere in the world. So that's sort of the process of collecting the data and the history of what got us to this point. But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the science. So as adduced by Kitching and his colleagues, the time we're dealing with in the sort of represented in the Antarctic rocks is a time when all the continents of the world were pasted together in what we today call Pangea. So climatically extremely different. Because the continents are glued together, you don't have ocean circulation. You're not evening out temperature gradients between the equator and the poles as much as today. And you also have these incredibly dry and incredibly hot continental interiors, because the sort of stabilizing or tempering effect of oceans is going to be a lot less when you put all these land masses together than if you have the current day continental configuration. In this Pangean map, the central transantarctic mountains are close to the very southern rim, the very southern edge of this. And the rocks that accumulated there accumulated in what we would call a foreland basin. So you had an active subduction zone, a tectonic zone, running along the southern edge here, where an oceanic continental plate was pushing under the edge of Gondwana, of the combined southern land masses, and creating a flexure, so that subduction would have happened out here to the west of what is the Antarctic Peninsula today. But as it pushed under the overlying crust, that overlying crust would bend up, creating sort of a valley or a flexure behind the leading edge. And into that is where those sediments were being piled up in Permian through Jurassic times. So geologically, that's what we're exploring. And this stack of sediments can be divided into a series of formations, beginning with, at the bottom, the Buckley Formation, which is from the Permian, and ending with a series of basalts, those volcanic rocks I've talked about, capping the whole series from the Middle Jurassic. And within this sequence of rocks, we find three principal time slices, or four principal time slices, containing vignettes or sort of information on the fauna and flora of Antarctica in its distant geological past. Starting at the bottom, in the upper Permian, in the Buckley Formation, we have those Glossopteris leaves, the ones that I talked about Falcon Scott finding. They are very common. And in addition to leaves, we find root horizons. So these are sort of the star-shaped roots of the Glossopteris tree. We find entire trunks and even sort of the fruiting bodies or the seed bodies of these seed ferns. So these were large tree-like plants. They are not related to anything alive today, but would have been unmistakably trees with trunks, branches, and leaves that would have been shed. So they were deciduous in a sense, leaving these leaf mats. And basically, much of the southern hemisphere, including Antarctica, would have been covered by these forests. So these are very productive, lush forests. Besides leaves, we find coal accumulations, which, as I said, are indications of very high primary productivity. To date, we have not found any vertebrate fossils there. We have evidence of insects because there are feeding traces on these leaves. And we have some possible burrows suggesting that animals with backbones were living there, but no fossils yet in these otherwise rich and diverse and plant-wise diverse environments. And then we get a very sudden shift in our rock record because we hit what is the Permo-Triassic boundary. This boundary marks the largest mass extinction in Earth history. Somewhere between 70 to 90% of species are thought to have gone extinct. And this extinction is thought to have been driven by massive volcanics in what is today Siberia, elevating atmospheric CO2 levels about fivefold. So from around 300 or more than fivefold, I should say, from around 300 to 400 parts per million, which we have a little bit less than what we have today, to over 2,000 parts per million. Basically, 5 times more CO2 in the atmosphere than we have today. That led to massive climate change and basically wiped out ecosystems on Earth. And we can actually see that in the Antarctic rock record, because once we cross this boundary, you go from abundant leaves and fossilized logs to nothing. There's about 20 meters of strata where you find no evidence of life. And then slowly you start picking up fossils, but not fossils of plants. Instead, it's fossils of vertebrates. And perplexingly, perhaps, the thing we find most of are amphibians. So temnospondyl amphibians are the most common members of the lower free malformation fauna. This is the one that was referred to as the Lystrosaurus fauna by Kitchen. And these amphibians come in a variety of sizes and shapes. None of them are huge, but conversely, none of them are small either. They're bigger than modern day salamanders and newts. They're probably on the order of a foot long, so close to or 1 to 2 feet long. And they come in a variety of skull shapes, where we think we have evidence of at least 3 or 4 families of amphibians present there. Here's a beautiful skull of one found on Kitching Ridge. There's the eye socket and the nostrils. It would be about 3 inches from snout to the corner of the skull here. And here's another type of specimen. And until recently, all of these were being referred to one species, which had been called Cryobatrachus kitchingi back in the 70s. This is the original specimen of Cryobatrachus. We no longer consider it diagnostic. We can't really tell what it is other than it's an amphibian. So we're going to have to revise the diversity of these animals in the near future. But I predict, along with my colleagues, that most of the new species we are about to name won't be Cryobatrachus, but the greatest diversity or change in diversity is going to be among these amphibians. So what we have here is small-ish predatory amphibians living in those braided stream environments that I talked about, and presumably feeding on small fish, young of other amphibians, and part of a sort of terrestrial ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of plants and is mostly dominated by small predators. We do have some plant-eating animals. These are the dicynodonts, like Lystrosaurus that you see here, that gives its name to the fauna. Lystrosaurus and dicynodonts are named for their strange dentition. They actually have beaks more like turtles. All that remains of their teeth are 2 tusks. Dicynodont means 2 dog tooth in Latin, or a combination of Greek and Latin. And you can see these things are still scaly. We know that from finds in South Africa. But they happen to be more closely related to mammals, actually, than they are to the reptiles of today. So in older literature, these would be called mammal-like reptiles. Now we would call them early synapsids. So they are actually more closely related to us than to reptiles, despite their sort of sprawling reptile-like gaze. And we think these animals were predominantly herbivorous, based on their body structure and the kind of shearing mechanism that they have for their beaks. A little bit more mammal-like, but still an early synapsid, is Thrinaxodon. You'll remember that slide of Kitching showing you collecting Thrinaxodon fossils on what has now become Thrinaxodon Call. This is a small, more predatory mammal-like animal. It's got interesting heterodont dentition, meaning that the teeth at the front and the back of the jaws are different. This is, again, a more mammal-like trait. And it's got this differentiation of the rib cage into longer ribs in the front and shorter, fatter ribs in the back, probably indicating that it had a diaphragm and a mammal-like breathing apparatus. So definitely something that's more similar to ourselves. About 1 to 1.5 feet long as an adult. And we've reconstructed it like this with a very mammalian appearance, much more erect posture, possibly covered with fur. Indications from bone histology, which I'll talk about later, are that this was a fast-growing and therefore probably warm-blooded animal. And these, again, would have been predators of small prey. That small prey might have consisted of some of the less frequently found reptiles we get there, like procolophonids. These animals would have looked like a tuatara or a lizard today, but actually represent a now entirely extinct reptile lineage. Again, very small animals. And overall, very small body size is highly characteristic of almost all the Antarctic finds, and also of all other early Triassic finds elsewhere in the world, reflecting what we call this Lilliput effect, which is typically that in survivor faunas that come after mass extinctions, most of the animals tend to be small. And small size being correlated to the fact that their energetic requirements are less, and that they can probably reach sexual maturity and breed faster so that they can replace and replenish their populations at a faster rate than larger animals that require more energy just to move and stay alive would do. We have other reptiles that are more predatory, including Prolacerta, again, a species known from South Africa and also well documented in Antarctica. And then perhaps one of the few endemic species. Remember endemism? I talked about it in one of the first slides. It's when an animal or an organism is restricted to one area, in its range is restricted to one area and not shared by other areas. So this would be the one exception to all of these animals being otherwise shared between South Africa, South America, and possibly other continents. We do have a little bit of evidence of larger animals. These are leg bones and vertebrae of a large-ish crocodile-like predator, so a reptile, an archosaur, indicating that possibly there were a few well-hidden larger predators on these landscapes. So, but otherwise, everything we find is small, body lengths under 3 feet, body masses under 50 pounds. In keeping with the Lilliput effect we see elsewhere in the record at this time. Interestingly, from a behavioral perspective, one of the things we find are burrows. They're very common. This is a burrow cast. So the burrow was originally dug out of this softer overbank sediment and then filled by a flooding event that covered the ground surface with layers of sand, but also filled in the burrow. And these burrows come in a variety of diameters and sizes, indicating that they were made by different animals, and that it was probably fairly ubiquitous among Antarctic animals of this time to be burrowing. In South Africa, where we find the same animals, we've been lucky enough to find animals in these terminal burrows, including that beautiful Thrinaxodon skeleton I showed you earlier, Lystrosaurus, and so forth. So we think, based on that, and the fact that the animals are shared between the two continents, that burrowing may have been an important behavior in all of these species, and in fact may have been critical to their surviving the Permo-Triassic extinction, whereas many other creatures went, bit the dust, so to speak. If we look at the different sites in the Cumulus Hills region, here's the Shackleton Glacier in the Cumulus Hills, and further afield, One thing we find is that we keep recovering the same animals in different places, different sites, and even between South Africa and Antarctica. So it's a low diversity fauna. Animals are abundant, but they're predominantly small. There's low diversity. We're finding the same few species in almost all of our sites. And this is probably consistent with both Pangea being in place so that animals can distribute widely on the continents, and the fact that we're dealing with a survivor fauna following a mass extinction. So the animals that, for one reason or another, be it burrowing or whatever it was, managed to make it through that extinction, they're the ones who sort of, took over the earth. And the beak shall inherit the earth is sort of the story of early Triassic Antarctic faunas. Once we start moving up in time towards the middle Triassic and the upper part of the Freeman Formation, though, that signal starts changing. We start finding different animals. For one thing, the amphibians get really big. They get giant. This is a skull of Antarctosuchus. It would be about 2 feet long from snout tip to base of the skull here. The whole animal would be something like 8 or 9 feet long. So pretty comparable size to a decent golf course alligator in Florida today that most of you must be familiar with. And we have a diversity of these things. So Antarctosuchus here has tiny, tiny little teeth along the edges of its mouth. The same size animal Cryostega from Antarctica instead has these big tusks both on its palate and along the tooth margins, indicating that it's taking down bigger prey and probably feeding much like the alligators I was just talking about. These are big animals, up to 12, 15 feet long. They would have lived in water bodies, again, telling us something about the climate of the time. And importantly, they are unique to Antarctica. There are very similar temnospondyl amphibians on other continents in the late, early to middle Triassic, but they're different. So we are starting to see an increase in endemism, uniqueness in the fauna, in the species that make up the fauna of Antarctica at this time. This is also true of the Dicynodons. So in the middle Triassic, from our little ancestor Lystrosaurus, we start getting these bigger hippo-sized Dicynodons, including one family called Cannemyriformes that, again, we find on various continents, including Africa, South America, and even further afield in Asia and Siberia. Antarctica has evidence of these animals too. It's not great. This is the back end of a brain case. This is the foramen magnum, or the part where the spinal cord comes out of the brain case. But it's enough to tell us, A, what kind of animal it is, and B, that we can't reliably refer it to any of the other Cannemyriform species that we know from other continents. So again, an indication that although at first blush, the animals in Antarctica are still similar to what we see in the rest of the world, they are just a little bit different. They're unique enough, representing their own endemic fauna. And then we reach a gap in the fossil record of vertebrates in the upper Triassic in the Fala Formation. But what we do find are plants, and fairly abundant plant fossils, which have been otherwise almost absent from the middle and lower Triassic records, except for a few bits of fossilized wood. In the Fala Formation, we start seeing coal accumulations, again, representing a fact that we are now building up so much plant material, so much primary productivity, that it's actually being buried and becoming part of the rock record instead of consumed by animals and fungi. And even the return of large trees. Here's a fossil tree stump poking out of the sediment. Various things like horsetails. These are big horsetails that would be 20 feet tall, and a variety of different ferns. So these are conifers. These are fern-like. Some of them are tree ferns. Dicroidium has two leaf types, hence the name. You'll see the more lobate and the sort of more finger-like ones here. And these are incredibly abundant, telling us that finally, somewhere long after the Permo-Triassic extinction, landscapes have again become forested, which is going to lead to changes in how water moves over the landscape. So we have meandering rivers instead of the braided streams, and a different, just entirely different ecosystem. And we can carry that information of forests and primary productivity up to the next geologic level, which is the lower Jurassic, represented by a rock unit we call the Hansen Formation. And here we find dinosaurs. So these are not the only dinosaurs from Antarctica. There are late Cretaceous dinosaurs from the Antarctic Peninsula. But these are the most complete and best preserved dinosaurs from this continent. They were originally found in 1990 through a stroke of luck. Here's a photo from 1990 representing what was the first find of a dinosaur that ultimately became known as Cryolophosaurus ellioti. And it was found by a British geologist named David Elliott, who was on his way to the top of Mount Kirkpatrick looking at these basalts, these volcanic rocks. And on the way, he stumbled across this thing. And as fortune would have it, my colleague and long-term Antarctic paleontologist and explorer, Bill Hammer, was on the continent at the same time, working in Triassic rocks. So he was helicoptered up to look at it and realized immediately that this was a dinosaur. So he abandoned his, Triassic amphibians, switched his attention to this site, and started the first of what would ultimately be 3 different expeditions to collect the dinosaurs of Mount Kirkpatrick. It was my good stroke of luck to join the 2010 and 11 expedition. Here's our team. There's Bill, myself, my then student Nate Smith, Phil Curry from the University of Alberta, and our mountaineer Peter Braddock. And this is that site that you just saw the dinosaur from. At this point, we were based out of the Beardmore Glacier region rather than the Shackleton Glacier region at what we call the Central Transantarctic Mountain Camp. Very similar setup to the one you saw. Again, residing in these small tents with a beautiful landscape in the background and having to helicopter into our site every day. Now, one difference was that Mount Kirkpatrick is the highest mountain in the Central Transantarctic Mountains. Those basalts that David Elliott was aiming for is up here at a little over 13,000 feet. Where Cryolophosaurus was found were these tan rocks, tan layers out here at about 12 to 12,500 feet. So it's really cold and the air is really thin up here. The mercury never got above minus 20 Celsius at this site. So this would be a lot of breaking rocks, shedding clothes because you get hot, and then immediately putting it right back on because the instant you stopped, you got cold. As I said, there were 3 expeditions to this site. And the reasons for that is it's actually an incredibly rich locality for fossils by any standard. So we actually have 6 skeletons from this mountainside. Here is the Cryolophosaurus quarry that produced not just Cryolophosaurus, but actually a second partial skeleton of Cryolophosaurus, as well as elements of a large plant-eating sauropodomorph. We found a smaller partial sauropodomorph here, another one under this rock overhang. So that brings us to 4, and then, or rather 5. And then right off the screen, we found the elements of yet another really big plant-eating dinosaur, which again is fairly fragmentary. But in just this area, not much bigger than a football field, we were able to collect parts of 6 skeletons of what ultimately are either 3 or 4 new species of dinosaur. The work was incredibly hard, as I mentioned. The rocks are silicified and baked, so they have to be broken by tools. You can't use the sort of plaster jacket techniques we would use elsewhere in the world. Water freezes. So that was a silver lining to having very hard rocks. They'd break clean and you would just take them down. And based on size, either sling them under the helicopter, as you can see in the movie footage right now, or carry them down to the helicopter site and put them inside the helicopter. Uh, but incredibly hard work. The biggest one of these that we moved was about 750 pounds. Um, again, in very cold and very thin air. So this was incredibly exhausting work. But the dinosaurs were well worth it. They're fantastic. So here is Cryolophosaurus. We have a partial skull. Here's a reconstruction of what it would look like. The name Cryolophosaurus means frozen crested lizard, and it refers to this sort of pompadour-like crest that the animal had on its head above its eyes. Weighing somewhere around 1,000 pounds and being over 25 feet long, this is a large predator. Not as large as T-Rex, but for its time in the early Jurassic, about 195 million years ago and 130 million years before T-Rex lived, this animal would have been sort of the dominant predator of its time. Here's what the skeleton would have looked like. We actually have most of the neck and back, much of the ribs, a good chunk of the forelimbs and hind limbs. And what we're really missing is just the distal part of the tail. So we have a good and the hands, a good representation of what these animals would have looked like. And Cryolophosaurus belongs to a small group of crested theropods that were alive in the early Jurassic that sort of sit as an early branch in the evolutionary tree of predatory dinosaurs. So as most of you likely know, birds are descendants of predatory dinosaurs. They sit sort of at the end branch here, along with T-Rex, Velociraptor, a lot of those animals you know from Jurassic Park. Whereas these Dilophosaurids are a much earlier branching group, so fairly distant from what we would consider your standard theropod dinosaur. But again, a small radiation of crested animals that otherwise includes Dilophosaurus from the southwestern United States, Dracovenator from southern Africa, and Sinosaurus from China. And they're all characterized by having these weird crests on their head. The crests look different from species to species, but they're always made up of the same two bones, the lacrimal in front of the eye and the nasal. And so these animals would have been sort of essentially very similar, except with slightly different headgear. And speaking of heads, we have sort of tried to peer inside Cryolophosaurus's mind. This actually took a lot of work. We had to take it to a industrial CT scanner at Ford Motor Company in Livonia in Michigan because of that heavy silicified rock to really get a good view and cut through, like the x-rays cut through. But we were able to find or build a beautiful brain case reconstruction. Here's the brain in red, the middle ear in yellow, and then in green down here are these air spaces that are in the bottom of the skull, underneath the brain, that are characteristic of both birds, many dinosaurs, and even crocodilians. And they are interesting for a number of reasons, including the fact that the exact configuration of those air spaces in Cryolophosaurus, here's the brain case CT in cross-section, is exactly the same as in Sinosaurus, this Dilophosaurid from China, again, cementing that early in the Jurassic, again, following an extinction event among vertebrate animals, you have, if not the same, then very similar animals populating otherwise very distant localities in the world around them. One thing that intrigued us about these Antarctic dinosaurs is that we knew they had to be living in partial darkness during the polar winter. Our paleo map reconstruction suggests we still would be far enough south that part of the year that you would have had no or hardly any sun and therefore no plant growth. And yet, size-wise, these animals are the same as we find elsewhere on the planet at the same time. But were they growing differently? Was this difference in plant growing seasons affecting the dinosaurs? And to examine that, we undertook a study of their growth by taking cross sections of their bones, looking at them under the microscope, and counting these growth rings. These growth rings are actually ubiquitous features of most vertebrate animals today. And they're usually laid down in either the dry season or in the cold season, depending on where animals live. And they're annual markers of growth. So we can count them up and sort of reconstruct the growth in Cryolophosaurus. And what we see is that our main skeleton is probably around 15 years old, would have been slowing in growth. So that was around its sort of time it would have reached maturity. And this isn't really too different from other Jurassic theropods that lived in more temperate or even equatorial regions. So, at least as far as this one dinosaur species goes, living in a more extreme environment with winter darkness for 3 to 6 months doesn't seem to have affected its physiology. Um, Now, if we switch to the plant-eating dinosaurs, we have a diversity of animals, both small and large. The largest of these is Glacialosaurus, would have weighed around a ton, only known from hind limb elements, so it doesn't tell us much about what the whole animal would have looked like, but there's enough there to both estimate its size and who it's related to. And then in the 2010-11 expedition, we also collected two more sauropodomorphs, or plant-eating dinosaurs, one from here and one very close by under this rock overhang. And it turns out they're different species. The one from under the overhang is the better preserved. Here you see a beautiful skull. There's the teeth. And here's a colorized CT scan of the skeleton with the forelimbs and hind limbs here in orange, ribs in purple, vertebrae in yellow, and uh, girdle elements in red, showing just how complete these animals are. So between the two specimens, which were side by side, we have nearly the whole animal. We're just missing the feet below the ankles and the tip of the tail. And here's a reconstruction of what this animal would have looked like. We still haven't named it. We're working on that. And it's a very small animal. So total length would have been about 6 or 7 feet from snout tip to tail tip. And again, we were wondering whether this was somehow related to them living in a high latitude environment, or whether they were just juveniles and therefore small. So we again undertook a histological analysis of various bones in their skeleton. And what we found was no evidence of growth lines in the leg bones, maybe 1 to 2 in the ribs, but again, suggesting that what we're actually dealing with is very young animals. Growth rates are very high, comparable or even exceeding those that we see in related species at lower latitudes, again, suggesting that winter darkness and the cessation of plant growth was not seriously affecting the physiology of these animals. So a little bit different from what we see in living reptiles today, where reptiles living at higher latitudes grow much more slowly than their relatives at lower latitudes. And then finally, we have another sauropodomorph, represented by the hip region and part of the legs, that again is different from the one we just saw. It's also a small animal, presumably juvenile, but its leg bones are just different enough that we think that they represent a third species. So within this one football field area of Antarctica, we have evidence of 3 herbivorous species coexisting, so very high diversity. They're not growing in ways that are fundamentally different from their relatives on lower continents. And so these ecosystems, in a sense, are not behaving the way ecosystems do today in terms of having lower productivity and lower biodiversity at high latitudes than at lower latitudes. And that's probably that Gondwanan effect that I've been talking about a lot. If we sort of try to look at who our Antarctic dinosaurs' closest relatives are, they don't represent an endemic lineage in the sense that their nearest relatives are also from Antarctica, but rather, if we look at the three groups, Glacialosaurus here, the first sauropodomorph and the second one here, they actually have closer relatives on other continents. So they're more closely related to animals on other continents than they are to their Antarctic species, the other Antarctic species. So again, they are endemic in the sense that they're unique species to the Antarctic environment, but they're not so different from the animals elsewhere. So we're still seeing this sort of imprint of Gondwana and the continents being together, and the ability of animals to distribute far and wide across these conjoined continents. So very different from what we see today, where different continents have very different sets of animals, and are often much more endemic, not just at the species level, but also at genus and family levels. So with that, I'll make a plug for the exhibit. This is old, I should say it's in Florida for a few more days. Please go see it if you haven't. There's also a 3D movie made in conjunction with our last expedition, which includes both footage from Antarctica, these lifelike reconstructions, probably playing at a IMAX theater near you. And then just to summarize, Antarctica's Mesozoic fossil record is still very meager. This is both due to the limitations on geological exposures laid down by the climate and the ice of Antarctica, also by the fact that we have worked there for only 5 decades relative to what we know about the rest of the world. But we clearly have evidence that in prehistoric times, this was a fundamentally different continent with plants and animals, very much dominated by the connections of Antarctica in the past to the other continents. We have no evidence of animals, but we do have evidence of forests in the Permian. The early Triassic fauna is a survivor fauna, very reminiscent of what we see of South Africa. Again, providing evidence of continental drift. And then slowly over time, we see an increase in endemism in the distinctness of the animals we find in the Antarctic record, going up from the Triassic and into the Jurassic. So with that, I just want to thank a lot of people who were part of the expeditions, the research, the funding, and thank you all for your attention. I've gone a little long, sorry, I tend to do that, but I can stick around for questions if people have any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Makoviecki. I want to tell you that you've been speaking to approximately 50 people between our Zoom audience and our in-person audience. And in person, we have nuclear physicist Will Schaefer, who as a Navy captain was instrumental in setting up the Antarctic nuclear power plant in the 50s.
Okay. That's very nice to meet you, Will, even if remotely. So
he salutes you. So do we have questions, ladies and gentlemen? No questions coming forth? I think we have been very well informed by your lecture, and I'm going to be looking for that movie that you referred to. Being in Florida where we don't have dinosaurs, we don't teach dinosaur paleontology at the university, and we don't, except for visits of just exhibits like yours. And also we had T-Rex named Sue here years ago. That's the only exposure to dinosaurs we have, unfortunately.
Well, you have a wonderful Miocene record in Florida, so you have plenty of good fossils. Just
yes, we sure do.
Different time slice.
We sure do. We have a wonderful fossil hall here at the University Museum. So we have here we go. Hold on just a minute, please.
Do we have any conjecture about the geographical location of the continents at various of these various times in the ancient history?
Yes, we do. Most of the way that paleo maps are reconstructed, and I've shown you sort of some graphics, is using a discipline called paleomagnetism. So you actually look at the orientation of magnetic minerals and rocks at different times. And normally magnetic minerals are going to align with the magnetic field, which does flip. So sometimes, the North Pole is where it is today. That's a normal cron. Sometimes they flip, and the North is where the South Pole is today. But they're always aligned that way. And if those magnetic minerals are out of alignment, they're pointing in a non-polar way, that's because the continents have moved. So you can actually track these back through time and place the continents. Based on those types of reconstructions and other evidence, we feel fairly certain that Antarctica in the Permian, so when we start our rock sequence, those sites would have been right around where the polar circle is today, so around 66 degrees south, and then slowly would have moved a little bit southward. Not as far south as we are now. The Shackleton Glacier region is 85 degrees south today, but within the polar region, probably maybe by 10 degrees less.
Oh, thank you. There's an excellent moving exhibit in the museum that how the continents have changed positions. So, okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoyed it. And are there any fossils, animals that have been named after you?
No, I don't have any honorifics yet. So
Not yet. Good luck for the future.
All right. So, well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. It was a great pleasure. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.